In a previous video, I focused solely on the root pass on a 6010 6-inch pipe, talking about the importance of feathering tacks and showing technique and showing arc shots, etc. And that video is called 6G Weld Test 6010 Root on YouTube, if you want to look at that and see just the root pass in its entirety. Some people are only having trouble with the root pass, and if that's all you're having trouble with, that's the video for you. This one is going to show this brief clip of the 6010 root pass, but then also the 7018 fill and cap. For both 6010 and 7018, we use the ESAB Rebel 285, 85 to 90 amps for the 6010 root with a 332 gap, 332 land, and then for the 7018 fill and cap, 1/8 diameter 7018. For the first fill pass, we're going to be using about 105 amps, and we'll crank that up a little bit for the 2-bead stringer. Lots of options here on the 285. When you're in stick mode, you select either 6010, 6011, or all other electrodes. But there's also a couple of other settings, one of which is hot start. That's really helpful in preventing porosity on starts as well as preventing from sticking the rod. But there's also arc force. So for 7018, generally speaking, you set that maybe around 30% or so for a nice buttery arc. 105 amps for that first pass. The root pass here has been ground smooth, but that is not always allowed on a test. I've taken tests before where I was allowed to use a grinder. I've taken tests where I was only allowed a file. I've taken tests where only allowed to use the grinder to feather the tacks, and then the grinder got locked up. So it's all over the board. Be prepared to not be able to use a grinder. This is my good friend Andrew Carden doing the welding today, and you'll notice he's pretty much going to be using one hand and propping with the other. So he'll swap off and do a little right-handed and a little left-handed welding. I'll try to call attention to that as well as any other technique that I notice going on. Now he strikes off ahead of where he wants to start and then welds over top of all the arc strikes. You do not want any arc strikes outside of the bevel on a pipe test or even a production weld. On a production weld, usually you can just grind them down. But on a test, sometimes you have to live by different rules. And sometimes arc strikes outside the bevel are cause for failure. So you don't want that. You want to keep all your arc strikes in there where you weld back over top of them. Now because this weld has been ground down, it's requiring quite a bit of fill. So you notice Andrew's kind of making circular motions and he's backing into the puddle to fill it flat. Probably would have helped a little bit if he hadn't ground down as much. That would have made a big difference in how easy it was to fill up. But he's doing a great job anyway, and by the end of this, it'll all turn out okay. So the same thing here on a restart, striking off ahead, coming back into that bead, welding over top of all the arc marks. You can see he's backing up here and there when he sees it needs a little bit of extra fill. Again, using one hand and propping, steadying with the other hand. I always found that when I do this, it's best for me to use a little circular motion like this or some type of little bitty oscillation, little tiny circles, because I'm going to shake a little bit anyway. If I'm trying to just drag a straight stringer in a straight line, it's not going to go well for me. Also, my eyes are a little older now, and just working the bead around like this sort of helps play the light for me and helps me see where I'm going, helps me line up on bevel edges and things like that. And talking about being steady and not leaving arc strikes, notice that Andrew's steadying up the rod with his thumb of the other glove just long enough to get the arc start going. Make sure he's staying in that bevel and not accidentally striking off outside the bevel. And then gradually, as he gets comfortable, as the bead gets going, he'll remove that thumb and strictly use one hand again. If you didn't see that, there will be a couple of other examples of it going forward here because we got several more beads to run here. For the first couple of inches of this side, Andrew didn't quite fill it in, so what he's going to do here on the bottom, he's going to overlap that bead by a couple of inches, and then when he turns the corner and starts going uphill, there won't be any trouble filling it in more. He's overlapping right here, not taking quite as much time as he was on that fill pass on the other side. Still overlapping, coming up on the start of that bead here. And then gradually turning the corner as you go uphill, you can carry more metal. And he's making a counterclockwise circle here again, backing up into the puddle just a little bit. trying not to chew those corners of the bevel off, so he's got a good straight guide for the cover pass. Most pipe codes have a limitation on the cover pass, so it's got to be at least flush, but not more than 1/8 of an inch in reinforcement. So in order to do that, you want to be just slightly below flush after you finish filling it up, but you don't want to be all the way flush, or it's hard to hold that limitation on a 1/8 max. A couple of things to notice right here before this restart. Andrew has switched hands to left-handed, and he's Q-sticking that rod to get a good start. Just for a moment, just to hold a nice steady arc, get a good restart, and not have any arc strikes. It'll turn loose in just a few seconds because that rod starts getting pretty hot pretty quick. Holding a fairly tight arc, making these little tiny circles, watching the edges of that puddle, trying to let the edges of that puddle flow out just shy of the edges of that bevel. You want to leave those straight edges intact so that you can have good straight lines for guidelines for the cover pass. If you nip those corners a little bit, it's not the end of the world. You just don't want to chew them off. More of the same here. Kind of a slow go, making sure that thing is filled up properly. Andrew switched back over to a right hand here. I'm going to speed the clip up here in a minute so you can see the twisting of the wrist in that motion. Now that only works if you have the rod chucked up in the stinger right. He's got it kind of at a downward angle so that when he turns his wrist, it maintains a favorable angle when he gets to the top there. So that hot pass is done. A little wire wheeling will be ready for the cover pass, but not quite. Went with a 1/8 70/18 all the way out because occasionally that's required. Probably would have gone a little bit better with a 332 hot pass followed by a 1/8 fill. Would have been easier to fill up just to have slightly below flush before the cover pass. There's a little low place. We're going to fill that in before we put the cover pass on. Sometimes you're going to have a low place, and rather than fight and try to just carry an extra amount of metal on the bead, it's better just to run a couple of little fill passes in that area. You can see this area here, that's going to be tough to fill that top bead in without undercut or without getting a low place. So Andrew just ran a couple of real quick stringers to sort of fill that in, and then once the cover pass is done, you won't even be able to see them. That's going to be much more manageable there.
Alright, so just a pro tip for when you guys are doing the bottom of your 6G, no matter if it's 4-inch, 6-inch, 2-inch, doesn't matter. One thing that you'll see in magazines, you'll see in articles, is to keep your rod 90 degrees this way and 90 degrees pointing towards the center of the pipe as you're going around. I would agree with keeping your rod 90 as you're going around, trying to keep it pointing towards the center. But what I would try to suggest is that on the passes on the bottom, that you angle your rod down so you don't get that sag underneath your pipe. I know all of you out there that are trying to pass this test, you'll get a sag and a dip on your bottom and you just can't figure out why that's happening. Try adjusting your rod angle at the bottom so it's pointing more, actually almost straight up, 90 degrees straight up, and you're going to see that as you're coming around, you're going to straighten it back out, pointing at 90 to the pipe and 90 to the center. And I think that's going to help you guys out with that.
We ran the first hot pass there at 105. We're going up to 115 for these two stringers. Plus, we let the pipe cool a good bit. Okay, here we go. Once again, striking up and then coming back and welding over top of the arc strikes. Hopefully here in a minute you can see that rod angle that Andrew was talking about. And I'll speed the camera up just a little bit again so that you'll see the way that he moves his body and changes the rod angle going up around the bend. Head the clip up a little bit here just so you can see that. See him change and the angle, the elbow comes up. There we go. Alright, here comes another restart. Using a little Q-stick method here again to steady the rod up. Make sure to keep those arc strikes where they need to be. Notice that he's not doing nearly as much oscillation on this 2-bead stringer. It moves along a little quicker, and right about here, just gradually turns loose of the rod once things are going well. Also notice Andrew's following that rod angle by twisting his wrists a little bit and moving his body a little bit, trying to keep the rod angle favorable, not have too much of a push on the top. Now we're going to do something on this pipe that you wouldn't normally do, and that is run both beads on one side before doing the other side. And that was really just to save a little bit of time where the cameras were positioned and whatnot. Had a limited time to get finished with this pipe on this particular day. But notice that rod angle that Andrew was talking about before. It's pointing a lot more straight up than straight into the pipe. And then gradually that changes as he comes up the pipe. Also, you're watching here on the second bead, you're watching the top of that bead, trying not to get any undercut, going slow enough to fill it in and not leave undercut and not have low places. Occasionally, on a restart, you're just going to stick the rod. It's just going to happen. One way to get around that and not leave arc strikes is just unclamp the stinger, just like that, and then pull the rod loose. And on a test, I would just get a brand new rod. In the field, you probably wouldn't do that. You probably just fire up with that same rod. On a weld test, you want to put your best foot forward. You do things sometimes on a test you wouldn't otherwise do in the field. That's just the way it is. Once you pass the test, game on after that. Alright, so once that side is finished, a good wire wheeling, we're ready for the second side. Same techniques apply here. You want to point that rod more straight up than to straight in the pipe to start with, and then gradually as you turn the corner and start going uphill, that's going to change. Striking the arc ahead of where you want to start the bead, and then welding over top of your arc strikes, keeping all your arc strikes within the bevel, not leaving any arc strikes outside on base metal for the inspector to gig you on. Andrew is overlapping the edge of that bevel by only about 1/16 of an inch. You don't want to go too wide. You could go a little more than 1/16, but in this case, if he does that, he might have trouble filling that second pass in. And you don't want to just barely nip it either, because sometimes you shake a little bit and you might leave a little evidence of straight edge there or unfilled bevel. That's no good. But it's also not good to go super wide outside the bevel. Ready for the last bead on here now. I'm going to try to go slow enough to not leave undercut and not leave any low places. Just trying to overlap that top of that bevel by about 1/16. That's a pancake hood that Andrew's wearing there. I get a lot of questions about it when I post videos with him wearing that. Super common for pipeliners and people that weld outside, and that's really the reason for it, is to block out all the sunlight. Because if you got glare in your helmet, it takes you a second or so to focus on the puddle. You might miss a tie-in, you might leave some undercut, you might fail an x-ray. So once somebody wears one, they tend to really love them, because it really helps them see a lot better by just blocking out all the light. Andrew is using an auto darkening Arc 1 single inside of his pancake hood. That helps in preventing arc strikes, and he can also do wire wheeling and grinding with the same helmet. All right, let's get a quick wire wheel on this thing and a little quick look at it. 2-bead cover pass. Hot pass run at 105, 1/8, 115 for the cover pass. Root pass done with 6010 1/8, 332 gap, 332 land, 85 to 90 amps. If you've got a 6G test coming up, I hope this video helps you pass.